In the post-truth political world we're now inhabiting, you need to get used to one very basic rule. Ignore what they say. Words are now cynically used just to taunt you with how casual and blatant the lies are, and or how easily they ignore the hypocrisy behind today's words. Instead, watch out for what is actually done and the logic that suggests that what they can get away with today, they will try to expand on tomorrow. The confounding illogicality of the public statements is designed to create the environment where they can act with impunity. So what am I talking about in practice? Well, first of all, let's talk about some of the actions with impunity that the Trump administration is taking just because they can. For example, at the point of shooting this video, they have blown up 3 boats in the vicinity of Venezuela, which they say they destroyed because they were drug runners whose wares were on their way towards the United States. Drug smuggling is not a capital crime in the United States. There was no due process of these human beings, no evidence presented, no case made. They were just killed. Extrajudicial killings. Barely any explanation. A few words that were extracted by continued inquiry, but nothing really about evidence or indeed proportionality of action. Nothing has happened about that, apart from some furious words by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Why not? Well, who has jurisdiction for this? If the US had been a signatory to the International Criminal Court, it might be the sort of case that would make its way to The Hague. But the US is never going to submit itself to such a court's jurisdiction. I mean, not even when it was run by presidents who were signed up to the rules-based international order, let alone now. Well, shouldn't the United Nations at least condemn it? Shouldn't those countries who are committed to the rule of law be expressing their shock and outrage and demanding an accounting? And wouldn't that mean American ambassadors would be being called in to be given expressions of concern about what their country is doing? Well, we all know the answer to that. Because you don't start an argument with a toddler with a loaded gun in his hand. That's the foreign policy approach to the United States right now. None of the countries in the world who have been falling over backwards to get important matters kept relatively untroubled by this Wild West US administration. None of them are going to throw that away over some people in boats near Venezuela, who may well be drug smugglers. And in some countries that actually could well be a capital crime. So, maybe there are more important battles to fight. And so, in that sphere, the killing of people with zero process in one part of the international locations, the Trump administration has found, yes, it can act with impunity, and so it is. They probably know they can't do it in many places in the world, not right now anyway, but they have a habit of pushing the line, so never say never. Within the United States itself, it is harder to act with impunity. There are more guardrails, more people prepared to resist, more legal devices for them to use in doing so. So in that case, the Trump administration acts with impunity anyway. And then when the pushback comes, as often it will come back, they'll say, "What are you getting so hot under the collar about? It was all a joke." So, for example, when Trump's FCC chair, Brendan Carr, spoke completely bluntly and seriously about how comedian Jimmy Kimmel should be taken off the air, or else the FCC would have more work to do, and we can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way, immediate action was indeed forthcoming. But then the backlash. Not just other comedians, not just Hollywood lovies, although Disney does have to worry about those to some degree, but also key right-wing figures who have been major supporters of Trump, Ted Cruz, Ben Shapiro, even Candace Owens. I mean, if you've lost Candace Owens, last seen going to court over insisting that Brigitte Macron, the French president's wife, is a man, I don't know what that says about you. But nah, you guys are all crazy, says Vice President J.D. Vance. That was just the chair of the FCC having a joke. Couldn't you hear the sound of guffawing across the land? It was a real knee-slapper of a joke. You guys just have no sense of humour. However, Vance went on, that comment by Jimmy Kimmel, that was not a joke. That was straight up disinformation, which is dangerous stuff. And President Trump slammed ABC Disney's decision, publicly mused about suing them, no doubt all part of a great big joke that has nothing to do with censoring critics. Some people are concerned about what Trump tweets, of course, so when he posts messages telling Pam Bondi to go after his enemies and bring indictments against them right now, after all, he said himself at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, after Kirk's widow, in the most powerful part of the entire evening, said she was going to forgive the killer, Trump followed immediately and said, not him, he hates his opponents, he doesn't wish the best for them. And then so, lo and behold, an indictment is quickly forthcoming. But no, we got that speech wrong, says J.D. Vance. Yes, of course, Trump was just joking. Couldn't you hear the sound of guffawing in the stadium? It was a real knee slapper of a joke. You guys just have no sense of humour. You see how this works. If there had been no pushback on either of those two, there would have been no disavowal, no surreal claims that it was all just a jolly jape. So, what next? Well, then there was RFK Jr.'s revelation that Tylenol, taken during pregnancy, causes autism. Significant studies say otherwise, but details. Trump came out and gave his advice to pregnant women, because you know they were all just waiting for that. And that advice was to, just suck up the pain and avoid taking Tylenol, which is paracetamol for Brits. This, along with the moves that RFK Jr. has been making on vaccines based on high levels of quackery, is turning into a step too far for some. Republican senators are reported to be, quote, increasingly uncomfortable with health actions being taken by the administration. There's even a first attempt to introduce articles of impeachment against Kennedy. But then J.D. Vance stepped in. Now, okay, this time he couldn't quite get away with saying it was just a joke, because that's hard to do when you've actually held a formal press conference on it. But he did say that, well, of course, the president didn't mean just suck up the pain and avoid taking Tylenol. What he was really saying was consult your actual doctor, despite him not saying consult your actual doctor. But then, of course, we know we have to take Trump seriously, but not literally. Except, of course, when he's just telling a joke. The point is this, when some people argue that when MAGA leaders contradict themselves, then an effective rebuttal is to point at their contradictions. We know from the stream of Russian disinformation and what we know about the conceptual reasoning behind it, the lack of consistency of any kind of rational sense, that is the point. It is designed to create the state of mind in the population and the media and the opposing politicians that enlarges the area within which the administration can act with impunity. So take the internal sphere. There are 3 conceptual projects presented so far which are intended to enable internal action against Americans with impunity. One of them is to label Antifa as a domestic terrorist organisation. One is to say that anybody who accuses this administration of being even just a tiny bit authoritarian is basically begging nutjobs to pick up their guns and start taking pot shots. And the third is that Pam Bondi can bring indictments against figures in the former administration, and everyone's supposed to pretend they didn't see Trump specifically telling her to do that in ways that he's not supposed to do. Let's take an example of the second one of those, just as a by the by. So here was Stephen Miller pointing at an interview with California Governor Gavin Newsom by Stephen Colbert. This language incites violence and terrorism, he says. Newsom went further than that, of course. In response to some of Miller's goading, he posted straight out the words, Stephen Miller is a fascist. Miller immediately pointed to this and then invoked the implication, which is the current mantra, that calling MAGA figures such names encourages political violence against them. Newsom's defence is that words have specific meanings, and if you call behaviours by a name that accurately describes those behaviours, then that's just a factual statement. What Newsom says, for example, is that masked men jumping out of unmarked cars, seizing people, those people disappearing with no due process, that is authoritarian, which seems a fair comment point at least. And then people point to times when Stephen Miller himself has referred to the other side as fascist, when Donald Trump or J.D. Vance have referred to the other side as, yes, fascist. Stephen Miller calling the Democratic Party an extremist organisation, a terrorist organisation. They do this knowing that simply pointing to the hypocrisy of what they're doing, pointing out that they themselves continue to do exactly what they complain about, doesn't work. The two sides are in such different information environments. The majority on their side never see the call-outs at all. And the two sides are in such tribalistic mindsets that even if they do, they mostly just disregard it as unimportant. The fact they are labelling the use of the authoritarian term or worse as equivalent to incitement shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, because if you are undertaking authoritarian actions, then you really want to strongly discourage and probably in due course prohibit people from actually calling those actions what they are. So yes, every time somebody does something, and we've now had some idiot shooting up an ICE facility, you can jump onto that and repeat, anyone daring to call us authoritarian or even nastier names, we will hold you personally responsible for this event that just took place. Here's Kristi Noem doing just that. For months we've been warning politicians and the media to tone down their rhetoric about ICE law enforcement before someone was killed. These horrendous killings must serve as a wake-up call to the far left that their rhetoric about ICE has consequences. Comparing ICE day in day out to the Nazi Gestapo, the secret police and slave patrols has consequences. Of course, calling your opponents far left when you've repeatedly said it's the far left who are the danger, exactly arguably the same thing. Only the far left use political violence, they say. Biden's administration was authoritarian and engaged in attacking free speech, they say. People can point to research that refutes those claims, but again, thanks to social media and the power of repetition, many people on the MAGA side are just totally convinced that it's true. Only the far left engages in political violence. Only the far left attacks free speech. And of course, anyone not on Trump's side is far left by definition. Centre left, moderate left, who are they? They no longer exist. It's all about using language to confound, confuse, and ultimately reduce the wider population to disengagement, because that is the outcome that enables action with impunity. Likewise, we now have Pam Bondi's Department of Vengeance bringing cases against the likes of James Comey. That is not political persecution, they say. This is justice. What Biden did was political persecution. That was criminal. This is totally different. Right now, the courts have not been rendered wholly complicit, so impunity is not yet achieved, but they're working on it. Whenever this government has tested the bounds and found that it can act with impunity, then it goes on to do just that. So you should expect that in all of these areas where they're getting currently pushback. It is a work in progress. That is the desired outcome. In some ways, this, I presume, is why Gavin Newsom is engaged on the style of campaigning that he is. Whether for good or for ill, he is adopting the same sort of provocative, in-your-face language, the absurd overstatement, the all-caps in-your-face rhetoric. And when the MAGA government says, if you call us authoritarian or fascist, we will blame you for violence, he has basically shrugged and said, you don't get to change the rules, and I'm going to keep calling you what you are, in his view. As his account said at one point, if you don't want to get called fascist, then just stop doing things that we understand as being fascist. On this basis, Newsom is kind of putting himself up as the canary in the coal mine. Never mind those comedians being pulled off the air. That's just the beginning. If and when the MAGA government starts arresting and jailing its political opponents, its active current opponents, Newsom will be first in line, because they will take those words as ammunition. Still kind of a problem for them that the courts aren't sufficiently compromised for them to do a full Putin on anyone yet. But that's the impunity they're aiming for. Clear as day. Now, the gleam of hope that comes through all this, as we've discussed before, is the rank incompetence that Trump has surrounded himself with. They are following the autocrats' playbook, yes. They can do a lot of damage with it because, for instance, when it comes to firing all the people with skill and integrity, well, yes, even a buffoon can do that. And speaking of Pete Hegseth, there has been a lot of speculation in the last few days that the big meeting he suddenly called without explanation of all of the top generals and commanders in the US military, this was going to be a moment of major escalation. And yes, indeed, if you have competent and determined authoritarians who aim and expect to be usurping the democracy of a country in due course, securing the loyalty and support of a military is number one of the list of things that you intend to do. And yes, they have fired anyone they thought was more committed to the Constitution than they were to President Trump, but they know there will be many, many more of those. So you could see that a big meeting like this, where nobody knows what's coming, where people get challenged to pledge their loyalty or leave, might absolutely be a thing that you could do. By and large, the inside word is that Hegseth actually is mostly focused on a big PR event for himself, where he's there exercising his personal authority over all these top generals. He's going to be lecturing them about grooming and the so-called warrior ethos. His speech will be recorded and maybe, just maybe, will be made public in due course. Some are even suggesting that Hegseth is promoting himself, his personal brand, with a view to challenging the current view that J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio are the only natural successors to Donald Trump. Now, this, of course, is also good news for the opposition. If a succession for the future of MAGA becomes a dogfight between various ego-blinded, incompetent men, that could be an enormous asset to the other side, which, on the current state of the other side, they're going to need all the own goals that the MAGA side can score to help them along.